I think at minimum, the UK will probably manage to overtake Canada as worst performing developed country over the next 4 decades.
That's the thing with the migration issue. All of our countries in the developed world are struggling with this. I think broadly speaking, a lot of our politicians treat us like we are incredibly febrile, easily riled up, dangerous mobs.
Douglas thinks that we shouldn't let the Palestinians stay in London.
My own view is that it shouldn't, and it shouldn't because it's not because it should be banned, but because it's a grotesque insult to the British people. It's a deliberately provocative day to choose for such a march. It's a deliberately provocative march.
The Telegraph also showed that around half of the organisers of the march are linked with bad organisations.
As the Telegraph showed just yesterday, around half of the organisers of the march are themselves linked with, which isn't at all surprising. We have commanders, after all, who live in London very safely, often on welfare.
Douglas states that it's intolerable provocation to the British public and government.
So, yes, I think it's an intolerable march. It's intolerable provocation to the British public and the British government and the British police, by the way, who Saturday after Saturday have been made to put up with unbelievable taunting and abuse from the marchers.
And the crowds are pushing the police further and more provocative.
It's very clear by now, Piers, that what is happening is that every week the crowds are pushing and seeing if they can push the police further and further, harder and harder, and be more and more provocative. And they're managing to do that.
Douglas thinks that large numbers of the British public are just not going to put up with this.
But this is culminating this weekend, and here's the thing. I don't think, and I certainly read and hear, that large numbers of the British public are just not going to put up with this. Well, we'll try to single those two things out for a second. First of all, I don't regard Nicholas Soames as a sort of hereditary inheritor of the mantle of Churchill just because he happens to be his grandson.
He believes the UK is in a deep, unsolvable crisis.
Besides what you quoted from Christopher earlier, he would never have said that right extended to supporting terror groups. I mean, we're in a total quandary in the UK, as you know, and it's a despicable quandary to be in. We host leaders. We have a former deputy prime minister of Iran living in Harrow. We've been at the centre of allowing these people to be in our country and indeed to plot terror from our country for years. So it's always a bit rich to hear the British, I think, lecturing others about being an unsound part of the international security community. As for the actual marches, look, I'm afraid that the rules on this are very, very clear. You are not allowed to glorify terror or call for terror on the streets of Britain. And that existed before the 2006 Act banned glorification, and it certainly exists now. I'll tell you what's unique about the population of Gaza. It's the only population in the world where people routinely claim are committing genocide, but which has a population boom all of the time. I mean, that strikes me as being quite an interesting thing about the Gaza. But as for the moral community, I want to make a very, very important point, if I can say so, on this, which is, people quite often abuse history, and they say things all the time. I mean, about the only thing anyone from history knows is about. Here's something I can tell you with absolute certainty, Piers, having not just seen some of the results of what did on the ground here in a few weeks ago, but having watched the videos of the unedited footage, which I was one of the journalists was sadly allowed to see the other day, I can tell you one thing: the comparison between and the is insufficient. And sorry, there's an incoming. It's fine. Sorry, it was a rocket coming. Looked like it was just going to land on us here.
In Sweden, those who break immigration rules face strict penalties.
As you say, this is in 2015, the Swedes opened their borders. They said it's incredibly important to be open-hearted and generous to the world and so on. But what they did was, as we just heard in the previous segment, they did what a lot of governments have been doing. You effectively punish people who come to our countries legally. You punish them and you incentivize people who break the rules and come illegally. And that's happening everywhere from Sweden to America to Britain and Australia. It's an astonishing mistake. But yes, I mean, as Rita says, you have this this crazy situation by Sweden. Do you remember the old days? We all used to talk about Sweden, always a Scandinavian option for everything. Anything in life could be improved by referring to Scandinavia. People would say, oh, well, the Swedish this, the Danish that, whether it was a hot drink or a way to feel good or a policy. It was always about Scandinavia. And then, as you say, Rita, you get this situation where you have now Sweden, the second largest number of any country not officially only after Mexico. Only after Mexico. And if I'd have said to you 10 years ago, what do you think about when you think about Sweden? Like me, you'd have probably said, well, I don't know, hot drinks, overpriced food, but nice people, or rather cold. You wouldn't have said, oh, the traditional Swedish. Never forget the intrinsic importance to our culture of grenades. But that's the case because they just didn't care about who they let in. And it meant that they were letting in military-aged males who very often lied about their age. And, none of this, there are legitimate asylum seekers in the world. Those people are completely stripped of their capabilities and their rights. When you allow, as I've seen this in Sweden myself, big bearded guys in their 20s who say, oh, I'm a child migrant, allowed into a school and so on, and they just lose control of everything. But, that's the thing with the migration issue. All of our countries in the developed world are struggling with this.
Millions worldwide are desperate to migrate to safer nations.
There are millions upon millions of people in the world who want to come to relatively safe, liberal, democratic countries like this one, like Britain, like America, like European countries. And the question is, are we able to step up to that challenge and actually bring in people at a reasonable rate, or is that too difficult for our politicians? Well, that's right. I mean, we know, James, don't we? We know the values of this. We know the reason why people come to our countries. There is no movement the other way. I mean, I always say, when the boats were coming to Australia with illegals from other parts of this region, it wasn't like they met boats the other way of Aussies desperately trying to flee the oppressive, conservative or otherwise government in Australia. The movement is always one way. I mean, you don't even get people moving from Britain to France on the boats. It's always France to Britain. People want to move up through Europe. When people cross the Rio Grande, when these Mexican cartels and others take very, very beleaguered people who've given their life savings to horrible, horrible gangs, you don't find a bunch of Texans saying they want to flee to the freedom of Ecuador. Now, my point on that is, therefore, we should have the courage to say, look, at the very least, we must be doing something right. There must be something we're doing right.
Despite years of awareness, immigration and integration remain unresolved issues.
It's a very strange thing, and as you said it before, we've got this situation where you can talk about it in economic terms, you can talk about it in housing terms, but the larger cultural terms are still a third rail. And I'm astonished that after all of these years, we've known the issues of immigration and integration for many years. I'm amazed that we're still in all of our countries at this very, very toddler stage of the debate. It shouldn't be that hard to say, look, if you want to come to Australia, you want to become part of Australia, you've got something to give to this country, and you will give to this country, and you want to be part of it, fantastic. Join the queue and let's see what we can do. But if it's the case that you want to come here and you don't really like the place, or you want to change the place, or you want to change the place back to the sort of place where the place you left from, and maybe some of the reasons why you left, then maybe that's not going to be a workable deal. Yes, I mean, effectively a mob outside of Parliament affected the workings of Parliament in Westminster. But, the really interesting thing on that is the politicians, even after that happened, couldn't identify who had been doing the threatening. They couldn't identify it. They talk about it, all of our politicians do that, they talk about these amorphous things like, we must stand against hate. Okay, and then what? And who? Get specific. Who were the group outside Parliament? Who was it projecting slogans onto Big Ben and our representatives are meant to be voting? Who is it that our representatives feel a threat from? And this can go wrong really fast if you don't identify it. I mean, our politicians should be frank. Are they feeling terrible threats and changes to their voting processes because of people from Wales? Or is it like people who is it the people who live and work in Chinatown? Is that a place that members of parliament shouldn't go? Let's be specific about it. And they cannot be, and even in Britain, and Rita and I have spoken about this before, even in Britain, when another of our MPs was a couple of years ago, even then, his colleagues couldn't identify the ideology that had their colleague. They talked about him as if he died of natural causes. And I think they do a great dishonor, not just to their colleague and to themselves, but to the public when they can't be open and honest about that. I think broadly speaking, a lot of our politicians treat us like we are incredibly febrile, easily riled up, dangerous mobs. Decent sort of person. Same thing with the British public. Same thing with the American public. We're not deplorables. We're not easily riled, violent gangs. So.
There was a group at a certain point in time. Do you remember when the atheist movement had hit this atheist plus movement? Do you remember Atheism Plus?
What was that?
Joe Rogan talks about the rise of the Atheist Plus movement. This movement promotes being anti-discrimination and anti-racist as new forms of belief.
It was weird, and it was a bunch of these weird virtue-signaling male feminist types that were adding, with atheism, adding a group of core values.
Oh, wow.
About, being anti-racist.
Their own 10 Commandments.
Yes. And so they called it Atheism Plus. And I remember watching this guy give this speech, this boring speech, on this sort of establishing this idea that because you don't have a religion, so we're going to be atheists, but with plus
There's a guy who's still selling his like silver water that he blesses from the River Jordan or something. It comes out some hose in his garden in Texas, yeah. And there are people who've been busted repeatedly, and they're still selling their wares. I always thought, if somebody actually made the prophet claim in our era, I think people would be surprised how many people would go along with it. It's the late George Steiner described. A phrase I love, nostalgia for the absolute. I love that phrase, a nostalgia for the absolute. I think a lot of people have it. I have it. We all have it to some extent. And the question is whether you can avoid it taking you to places that would demoralize you and lead you to a bad place.
He questions the assertion that our basic shared ethics are self-evident.
It's not a secret, that having been said, I was born and brought up a Christian, as a believing Christian, from I think most of my life, including through my adult life. And I'm now in, I suppose, a self-confessedly conflicted, complex situation of being, among other things, an uncomfortable agnostic who recognizes the values and the virtues that the Christian faith has brought. I think I sort of laid out how I think our civilization, our culture has got to the stage that it is at the moment and its current uncomfortable relationship with faith. I tried to lay that out in the strange of Europe. I still believe what I wrote there was accurate as a diagnosis of the era. But it's a very uncomfortable, as I say, position that someone like me is in, because I say, there has been a period of rejection of faith, particularly from what in our lifetimes has been known as the New Atheist movement, which made claims that were self-confessedly wrong. That, for instance, actually I think as a late friend of both Tom Wright's and mine, Rabbi Jonathan Sachs once said, that the claim that, for instance, morality was obvious was obviously wrong. The claim that basic ethics that we might share are self-evident is self-evidently not the case. One doesn't have to be an ethicist to know that. You just need to travel. You need to read, look and listen, and to know that's the case. So there has, in my view, I think we spoke about this before, Justin, that there has, in my view, been an interesting movement in recent years, which I think Tom Holland, who you mentioned earlier, is certainly an example of people saying, actually, if we go back and look at this, what we have and what we like does have roots in this, in the Christian story. Now, the follow-on question from there, I suppose, is, well, what do we do about it? And I think that a great failing of our time has been the tendency to talk past each other on this. The religious tend to say, well, it's easy, you just have to believe. If you recognize these virtues and values, then believe, and doesn't take into account the fact that very many people today, it is harder than that, for all sorts of reasons we could go into. But I would just make one other observation, which is that even outside of faith, I have an added discomfort, which is the discomfort of a non-believer who is disappointed by the behavior of a believing church. Now, many people think that's paradoxical, but it isn't at all.
Based on his experience, Douglas observes many churches evolving into something else.
Not only was brought up in, but afterwards sought the church as it has been in England, and its jewels and gems of the King James Bible, the Book of Common Prayer, and much more. And it's been my experience, as it has been for many other people brought up in recent decades and last century and more, that one has observed the church giving up its jewels and becoming something else. And actually, that irritation I feel from the outside, albeit from the outside at the moment, that irritation I feel about the church hasn't gone away even whilst being outside it. A fear, it comes back to that article that provoked Tom Wright's excellent letter. My fear is constantly the church is not doing what so many of us on the outside would like it to do, which is to be preaching its gospel, to be asserting its truths and its claims. And so when one sees it falling into all of the latest tropes, one just thinks, well, that's another thing gone. It's just like absolutely everything else in the era. Everything in this boring, monotone, ill thought out and shallow dialectic. And so as I say, I'm a disappointed non-adherent. You can't wish things you know and wish them unknown, or wish them unlearned. And this is something I think is very important in all dialogue between believers and non-believers. I just wanted to say, I wouldn't like it to be anyone to take away from this that I simply think that the church has a PR problem. It isn't just that I think that the presentation is wrong, or that there's a mistake in, for instance, falling into the religion of anti-racism or anything else. It's that I do believe that doing that means that the church fails to tell its own story. We had an article in the Spectator, I think last week, from my friend.
He believes it's not just a PR misunderstanding, but a missed opportunity within the church.
He made a very powerful point about the figures.
I think at minimum, the UK will probably manage to overtake Canada as worst performing developed country over the next 4 decades.
Reform is led by the man who took Great Britain out of the European Union.
So I think that makes Britain singular and worthy of tremendous admiration.
The aim of reform is to bring back classic liberals and the moderate right.
Nigel Farage, who is the man who took Great Britain out of the European Union with Brexit, and who now runs a political party in the UK called Reform.
The foundation of identity must be reclaimed and oriented correctly.
The aim of Reform is to shake the conservatives up, let's say, and return the classic liberals and the moderate right to something approximating, what would you say, an orientation that's actually based on the fundamental principles of Western civilization itself.
British common law translated biblical narratives into effective policy.
Judeo-Christianity at the bottom, the democracy that emerges out of that as a consequence of the concept of the sovereignty and divine import of the individual, the family above that, the community, the city, the state, the nation, under God, that entire subsidiary structure, to return to an orientation that makes that primary and the foundation of identity itself.
British common law stands as a monumental achievement, says Jordan.
It probably did the most effective job of any modern state of translating the narrative structure of the Judeo-Christian biblical corpus into policy. And it did that partly explicitly in its parliamentary structure, but it also did it even more wisely with its common law tradition.
If globalist liberals have overrun conservatives, what hides in Labour's shadows?
I mean, English common law is a complete bloody miracle. Bottom-up law. I mean, God, what a phenomenal accomplishment.
I'm watching with apprehension as the UK populace wanders over the brink, going to elect a Labour government in all likelihood.
Self-governance will distill Britain's thoughts and aspirations.
This concerns me a lot, because if the Conservatives have been overrun by globalist liberals with a progressive agenda, I can't imagine who's lurking in the background on the Labour side. Well, I can imagine because I worked in universities, so I actually know exactly who's lurking in the background. And so I'm very apprehensive about what a Labour government will do to the UK.
Jordan claims that the UK will probably manage to overtake Canada as the worst performing developed country.
And the hopes and aspirations of those that voted for them, and I gave them considerable help with that victory, the thoughts and aspirations were that with self-government, the numbers coming into Britain would reduce. With self-government, illegal immigration could be effectively dealt with. And another crucial group, 5.5 million men and women running small businesses, acting as sole traders, believed that the massive regulatory rule book that had been put on top of everybody, taking away their time, their effort, that could be reduced so that we can encourage entrepreneurship. We can encourage real economic growth. And so the Conservatives were riding on the crest of a wave, and many said, well, Boris Johnson will be Prime Minister for 15 years. And what has happened over the last 5 years, in my view, is they have betrayed all of those hopes in absolutely every way. Elected as Conservatives, but they've governed as metropolitan Liberals. They introduced net zero policies. So insane was some of it that Boris even suggested that we take out of production 30% of our farmland and rewild it. When it came to getting rid of regulations, basically nothing was done. In fact, arguably, for many sectors, they're now living under more bureaucratic control now than they were as members of the European Union.
The government abandoned plans to turn legislation into asylum centres. These English politicians, they speak separately from people.
This is a situation in Ireland that's been developing probably since November 2022, when the government here decided to abandon all planning legislation, allow office buildings to be turned into asylum centres, mainly for single males in the 18 to 30 kind of category, and impose those centres into mainly working class communities which are already devoid of any real services and are abandoned in general by the political and NGO class. And we have in Ireland now a country that's run by politicians who are more interested in what their European masters think of them than they are about the Irish people. We've a political and NGO class which is beholden to woke liberalism. And we have, you wouldn't believe, in this country, 33,000 NGOs who receive €6.5 billion per year and employ around 200,000 people to lobby government.
And the big one is legal immigration. And just to give people some context on this, in the late 1940s, it was very much felt that we owed a huge debt to the British Empire, British Commonwealth, because in two world 40% of the contribution came from the Commonwealth. Canada, of course, your home country, being one of the most remarkable of them. And so began legal immigration from the West Indies and elsewhere. And it ran all through the late 40s, the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, right up until Tony Blair got in. It ran all through that period with a net migration level of 30 to 40,000 people a year.
Murray is worried about the United Kingdom in these circumstances.
Malachy, how does this happen? We've got an audience here yesterday, over the weekend and today who are looking at this and saying this wouldn't be allowed to happen in England. And these politicians, they speak separately from people. People feel totally detached on this, that they have no say in this whatsoever. How does this situation come about that the politicians are so out of touch?
There's a total disconnect between the Irish political class and ordinary people. If you look at what happened last week, for instance, on Monday, now the protest in Coolock has been going on. There's been people sitting outside that protesting in the camp for 3.5 months with no violence, no difficulties, and the police moved in at 3:30 on Monday morning and moved them out. And that led to some difficulties during the day, and there was a JCB digger burnt out. But what exacerbated the situation was that the Gardaí, and the people who are doing what they call rioting, and you come from the North, Eamon, the rioting in Dublin, wouldn't even merit the name riot in Belfast.
The woke liberals claim migration is essential for the health service.
There'll be a monarchy. I would worry about the United Kingdom in these circumstances. As you say, Piers, I mean, the gains Sinn Féin made in the local elections, historic gains, should be troubling to anyone who is, like me, a unionist. Sinn Féin, of course, is an Irish nationalist party and is as well, in my own view, an extremist party. And that isn't mere rhetoric. Mary Lou McDonald, the head of Sinn Féin, has an unbelievable track record. I mean, just that you mentioned these earlier. There's only one statue to in Europe, and it sits in the park in Dublin. Sean Russell, an IRA member who was on a German U-boat in 1940. There's a statue to him in Dublin, and Sinn Féin always pay their respects there. Mary Lou McDonald, a couple of years ago, was taken there to pay her respects. She was, as it were, bloodied by the more militant wings of Sinn Féin. That's totally normal in Sinn Féin history. It's not just that they were an extremist party in the past, it's that they are in the present. It's not just that they're Irish nationalists, that they are actually extreme Irish nationalists, violent Irish nationalists, always have been, and seem to continue to be. I think it's an incredibly worrying development. As you say, alongside the ongoing success electorally of the Scots nationalists in the north, it's certainly possible we could see the breakup of our country. It's something where I think everyone who recognises that the United Kingdom's been an enormous force for good in the world should really be very worried about. We should be very troubled by that.
Jordan warns of the havoc a Labour government could wreak on the UK.
Well, we've gone from a population of 3.5 million to a population of over almost 5.5 million now, without building any infrastructure to deal with that. We have a shortage of hospitals, we have a shortage of schools, but most particularly we have a shortage of housing. We have 14,000 people in emergency accommodation, Irish nationals in emergency accommodation. The average price for a new house in this country now is about 450,000, which Dublin City Council somehow thinks is affordable. We have average rents for a one-bedroom apartment in Dublin, €2,000, a three-bedroom house, €3,500. And the woke liberals will tell us, well, we need migration to run the health service. Well, if we didn't increase the population the way we did, the health service wouldn't be under the strains it's under. And also, our own doctors and nurses are being forced to emigrate because they can't afford to live here. So if they could stay, we wouldn't need to import the people. But we have a class that believe, and they talk about international obligations and the law. As far as I'm concerned, the government's obligation is to its own people. And we had the ludicrous situation, for instance, of the High Court in Dublin saying that the Irish government couldn't deport anybody back to the UK because of the Rwanda policy. And they said that the UK was not a safe country to return people to.
I'm absolutely jaw-droppingly amazed that the Conservatives adopted net zero policies under Boris Johnson. It's like, what the hell were they thinking? The most skeptical part of my brain, and I suppose the rude part, thinks that this was cooked up by Boris Johnson to impress his young wife on the personal side, and that the Conservatives as well as a group lacked a vision so comprehensively that they had to turn to this idiot climate apocalypse mongering that's used by power-mad tyrants to cow the public into delivering them all the authority and power.
The centre-right must be reshaped to reflect the silent majority's voice.
And so what do you think a Labour government will do to the UK?
Yeah, I mean, Keir Starmer has no leadership qualities whatsoever. He is devoid of any sort of charisma at all. And people do need a leader, that inspires them to a certain degree. He's kind of doing well because he's not the Conservatives, and there is revulsion. There is revulsion at them, a sense of betrayal about them. On the face of it, his manifesto on climate change is almost identical to the Conservatives. His manifesto on economics is almost identical to the Conservatives. But I think we know that what we'll see is trans ideology in the ascendancy. We'll see more legislation designed to divide us up into different groups rather than bring us together as human beings equal before the law. I look at his potential front bench of the top ministers. I see very little competence whatsoever. He's almost going to win by default, as opposed to, a big enthusiastic wave of support. And so in some ways, I think there's every opportunity for this just to be a one-term Labour government. There'll be no honeymoon. There'll be no sort of after-victory glow. He faces a big set of problems, the ones I mentioned earlier, the population explosion, the fact our public services don't work, the fact young people can't get a house and even their rents take up over half of their income. And he won't have the solutions to any of it. He's campaigning on a slogan of change, but actually it'll be more of the same, just ever so slightly worse.
Anti-oppression activists in the US decry UK colonialists due to the UK's success.
So here's the opportunity. The opportunity is to reshape the centre-right of British politics, to be where the silent majority actually are. Now, I know that the British Conservative Party have been around for 190 years, but nothing necessarily lasts forever. And what I'm doing with Reform UK is I am taking those stances on all of those issues that I think give us the kind of radical change that we need. And I use the word radical in an old-fashioned sense of the word. You see, I'm a traditionalist. I think that our culture matters.
Breaking up into these sort of mini national states within the United Kingdom, I think, would be a disaster.
So first of all, we have to accept to some degree that the willingness to use power and compulsion and to keep is relatively ubiquitous across the entire human family, let's say, and that opposition to that emerges with difficulty and rarely. And then you have to ask yourself, what are the preconditions for that kind of opposition? And it was certainly the case with Wilberforce, as far as I can tell, that he was driven by the conviction that all men and women are made in the image of God, and that it was a violation of a transcendent ideal that in and of itself is the violation of a transcendent ideal. And that is something that's deeply rooted in the Christian tradition. I have tried to think my way around this, right? Because I don't like to multiply unnecessary metaphysical presumptions. But I can't see at all that opposition just would have emerged the way it did in Britain if it wouldn't have been able to draw on a well of metaphysical and religious presupposition that was predicated on the idea that each person has a soul, and that soul in some manner has a divine value.
And so, yes, I think that makes Britain singular and worthy of tremendous admiration.
Britain's governance legacy worldwide is no mere accident, believes Jordan.
You know, the anti-oppression people in the US who decry the UK colonialists in particular for their oppressive policies are spitting in the face of the only political system that ever successfully controlled, and not only practically because of the British Navy on the high seas, but also metaphysically and politically. Like it was the British who decided hands down, that was wrong, and then did something about it. And that was documented historical reality. The reason for that is because the British parliamentarians were called to their conscience by English evangelical Christians, essentially, Wilberforce in particular, who said, by the doctrines that you claim to regard as holy, this should not stand, and therefore can't. And Britain did that, and the Brits as well, even in relationship to the empire. It was at the same period of time that the Brits were already deciding that colonial rule in India had to be aimed towards the emancipation of the Indian people and their elevation as responsible individuals to the realm of sovereign citizenship. And that's an amazing thing for an empire to conclude. And you can be cynical about the lag of time it took, but it didn't take that long. And India's doing pretty damn well. And I think that the British bequested their gift of governance all around the world. And that's not fluke, and they deserve credit for it. And it would be a catastrophe for Great Britain to fall down the rabbit hole of self-abnegation and not realize that it's an amazing place. I mean, there's no US without the UK. I mean, the Americans like to think that, the tradition of freedom in the US is the American Revolution. It's complete bloody nonsense. And we knew that in Canada because we knew that what the Americans did in their revolution was fight for the rights of Englishmen. And that is what they did. And that doesn't take away from the American Revolution, but it links what happened in the US to, a historical progression that had gone on for centuries before that, and that was unstoppable, right? And that was the revelation in the political space of the Judeo-Christian revelation, fundamentally, as far as I can tell.
And so I just can't wrap my head around the conservative shift to net zero, not only because it's such a profoundly anti-conservative movement, at least with regards to such things as entrepreneurial activity and freedom, and it's profoundly anti-subsidiary, so it works against the spirit of distributed responsibility. And the economics of a shift to net zero are so appallingly catastrophic that it's a miracle that anybody who could count would even ever consider it. So, what the hell was going on with and certainly this is part of the reason they're being devastated at the moment. What in the world was going on with the Conservatives? Where were their heads at?
If anyone thinks that all of this just glides by endlessly without any political consequence, I'd just say, raise your eyes a little and look to the continent.
They're offering people the best chance they'll ever have in their lives to get to civilization, or civilization to get to them.
Some people wished for chaos, only to be proven wrong along the way.
I've no particular desire for the worst things I diagnose and worry about coming to be. I mean, I think there are some people who are so incredibly narcissistic that they would rather the world went to hell as they predicted than that they would prove wrong along the way.
We pretend that the opposite in reverse is not going to have any implications and consequences.
And yet we pretend that the opposite in reverse is not very interesting, not going to have any implications and not have any consequences. It's all going to keep going on. I just don't think it will.
Murray wishes more people could take the attitude that he has taken throughout his life.
And when people rail against things like this city we're sitting in, think that it epitomizes capitalism and patriarchy, racism, more and more, I wish more people could take the attitude that I've taken throughout my life to these things, which is, you don't have to be tub-thumping, you don't have to be a wild flag-waving patriot or anything like that.
Murray urges that your attitude should be gratitude.
But your attitude should be gratitude. I mean, it's not as if this is nothing. The city we're sitting in is enough for a whole lifetime, and a very, very well-lived lifetime.
He insists this problem can't be enforced by government.
This can't be done by government diktat. It can't be done because the President of the United States or the Prime Minister of Great Britain says that it should be so. There are certain things they could not do that might make it easier, but this just comes from people.
Immigration issues are the result of generational political failure.
Well, obviously, it's a political failure, a generational political failure that's just sped up in recent years. That it has happened, as you said, under consecutive leaders who've promised that exactly this wouldn't happen is a disaster for Britain. Quite what a disaster it is, I think we can already start to see.
The continent shows that immigration has serious political consequences.
I remember when Giorgia Meloni was described as this far-out, far-right political leader in Italy, and she's now Prime Minister. I remember when Geert Wilders was described as this far-out, far-right political figure who wasn't even allowed into Britain in 2009 by a Labour Home Secretary. And now he's the main party leader in the Netherlands. So if anyone thinks that all of this just glides by endlessly without any political consequence, I'd just say raise your eyes a little and look to the continent.
For the first time, a border force is returning migrants to France.
A border force takes migrants back to France for the first time. Wow, that's amazing. Border force took migrants rescued from the Channel back to France for the first time yesterday, because the Prime Minister says, or as the Prime Minister says, he wants an asylum seeker returns deal with Europe. Now, this is an unprecedented step, I think it's fair to say, actually. 13 asylum seekers were taken to Calais. Now, what does this mean? Does it actually signal a closer relationship between Britain and France, an entente cordiale? And of course, this comes when the EPC is meeting as well. And of course, Keir Starmer all over the leaders of the European countries.
This week, we hit the milestone of over 1,000 migrants crossing via the Channel in a week. Now, on Monday, there were 427. They crossed in 7 boats. On Thursday, 317 on 6 boats, and another 413 on 7 boats on Friday. Now, that's a total of 1,157, plus 85, I think, today. Sadly, in between that, we also heard of the deaths of migrants, and others were rescued. Amazingly, though, 1 boat was turned back in French waters.
The parties have been talking about immigration, but what does the public think? Well, an exclusive poll for Sky News has found that across the country, 43% of people asked thought that immigration has a negative impact on British society. That's compared to 35% here who say it has a positive impact. So clear difference there. And there are also clear differences between age groups. 54% of 18 to 24-year-olds thinks that immigration has a positive effect. But the older you get, the lower this number comes down. When you get to 65 and over, only 20% of those people thought immigration is good for society. And the results vary according to location. Actually, it's only in London and in Scotland that people were more likely to say that immigration has a positive impact. So the lighter the colour here, the less supportive people are of immigration. You see that band here, Northern Ireland not included in this survey.
Reform is the only party seen as honest about immigration views.
But the poll also revealed deep political distrust among the public. 52% of people said they think Labour aren't telling the truth about what they really think about immigration. Not much better for the Conservatives, only 49% here, so not a big difference, saying the same thing about them. The Lib Dems doing slightly better, maybe they spelled it out better. But every region, every demographic distrusted the main 2 parties here on this point. The exception here, Reform UK, the only party people think are telling the truth about their views on immigration. 60%, big number, agreed the party was saying what it genuinely thought. That doesn't mean they necessarily agree with the public, but they do think they're saying what they think. And the people don't really trust the main 2 parties to follow through on their promises. People thought that immigration would increase under both a Labour, that's what they're talking about here, and under the Conservative government, whatever it is, despite believing that the policies of the parties is to reduce it. And finally, respondents also thought that cutting immigration would have a negative impact on the NHS, on hospitality, and on social care, but a positive impact here on housing and the housing crisis. So how do we take all that together? Well, the public understands that cutting immigration would hurt those very important sectors. So does it want politicians to be honest about that and cut immigration anyway? Or does it want to do the same things as the parties are doing, saying that immigration is too high, but to avoid damaging those sectors, keep it high while still complaining?
Murray urges us to live the good life we fought for until yesterday.
My own view is that it should
it should partly be done by living the life that we thought to be a good life until yesterday. We're very unlikely to come up with an entirely new definition or invention, very unlikely that we're going to invent new gods, very unlikely we're going to come up with new religions, very unlikely we're sitting here in Florence, very unlikely we're going to be able to do anything this good again. So why don't we have the recognition of what a good life was that was very recognizable until yesterday? Now, that can't be done. Roger Scruton and I were talking about this recently. This can't be done by government diktat. It can't be done because the President of the United States or the Prime Minister of Great Britain says that it should be so. There are certain things they could not do that might make it easier, but this just comes from people. It comes from individuals and people leading by example. When I discuss many of the things that came up in The Strange Death of Europe, sometimes people say to me, you seem, well, some people say, but you don't seem as het up about it. And that must mean that you know it's over, because otherwise you would be more.
Yes, there's a difference between fight and resignation.
Yes.
There's a difference between those two.
And you work out, don't you, as an adult, what it's worth wasting yourself on, and what points you should keep making, and when you've made them enough, and when you've hit your head against that wall enough,